Wonder Woman by Charles Moulton. Charles Moulton was, in reality, William Moulton Marston, a Harvard-educated psychologist who taught at Tufts University in Massachusetts. The pen name Charles Moulton was a combination of Marston's middle name and Max Gaines' middle name, Maxwell Charles Gaines. Well, that may sound kind of odd. How the heck did you wind up with this pseudonym that is the middle names of the guy who invented comic books and a psychologist who, as it turns out, was the guy that invented the polygraph, the lie detector? Actually, his work on the polygraph was dependent and reliant in a lot of ways on the work of his wife, Elizabeth Holloway, who was a psychologist and had a law degree. And her work had shown that blood pressure is affected by honesty, that the stress of lying causes a change in your systolic blood pressure. So he and his wife perfected this machine, the lie detector. So how the heck does all this get connected with comic books, and how is it connected to Sterling North? Well, Marston got a lot of publicity in the 1920s with his introduction of the polygraph, and a lot of attention, a lot of publicity, to the extent that by the early 1940s, he and his polygraph were appearing in commercials like this one for Gillette razor blades. He was also hired on as the psychology advisor to the magazine The Family Circle, which basically was geared toward housewives. The magazine actually was around for a very long time. I remember as a kid, my mom always having them around. In fact, it lasted from 1932 until December of 2019. So it hasn't been gone that long. And like a lot of other similar magazines that you may have seen on the racks at the supermarket, in addition to having things like information about celebrities and recipes and stuff like that, there's always psychology quizzes and psychology articles and things like that. So that's where Marston came in with the Family Circle. In October 1940, Family Circle published an interview with Marston on the subject of comic books in response to the assertions earlier that year, just a few months earlier, by Sterling North, essentially saying, well, Sterling North raised some interesting points. Are they true? And Marston came from the complete different direction. He defended comic books. He defended them vigorously as modern mythology, far from saying that they destroyed young people's minds. He pointed to the potential that existed in comic books for edifying young minds, that it was more than just interesting stories that made Superman so popular. It's the fact that Superman had tied in to classical mythology in such a profound and successful way. Well, that's going to make people like Max Gaines love William Moulton Marston. In fact, Gaines contacted Marston and asked him to join his educational advisory board for All American Publications. In fact, Gaines went beyond that. He invited Marston to create a superhero, to create and write a superhero for All American Publications, using his scholarly academic background, his expertise in psychology, Plus, it didn't hurt that Marston was also an author of fiction, and in 1932 had published a novel called Venus with Us, A Tale of the Caesar, a sweeping historical novel. So he seemed like an ideal choice. And Marston agreed. Well, he agreed to the job, and he agreed he was an ideal choice. So there were some things that Max Gaines didn't know or didn't quite understand about William Marston, among which was the fact that he was very much full bore a feminist. He believed not only that women were equal to men, he believed women, he said, were superior to men and should run the country, and eventually would. And beyond that, he talked about how, that really strong women who are balanced out by having sort of tender and emotional sides to them are the perfect balance for leadership, and that true happiness for a man came in submitting to such a woman. And one has to think that if Gaines were even aware of the novel Venus with Us, he didn't read it. This is a reissue of the book that came out in the early 1950s that has a cover that more accurately portrays what is in the book. The reissue retitled it The Private Life of Julius Caesar. You can see there's in the upper right-hand corner of the front cover, there's quite a bit of whipping going on there. There's some crucifying on the back. There's beating and torture. And there's a lot of naked ladies. And there's a lot of references to slave girls and Vestal virgins and etc. As one reviewer described it, it was basically a sex romp in which Julius Caesar encounters all these different women, all of whom in one way or another force him to submit. Some other interesting facts about William Moulton Marston that Gaines was no doubt unaware of. Yes, he was married to Elizabeth Holloway Marston, an accomplished psychologist in her own right and a lawyer. Also, there was a woman named Olive Byrne who had been living with him for 20 years in a polyamorous relationship. They had met, in fact, when Olive Byrne was William Marston's graduate assistant. Olive was also a writer, and her pen name was Olive Richards. It was Olive Richards who interviewed Marston for the family circle. Well, that's interesting. Also interesting is the fact that Olive Byrne was the niece of Margaret Sanger, the famous feminist from the early 20th century and founder of Planned Parenthood. Further making things, complicating things, I guess. Well, it depends on your perspective. Maybe it wasn't complicated to them. There was another woman named Marjorie Wilkes Huntley. I couldn't find any young pictures of her, but she was sort of a part-time, on-again, off-again member of the family. She had come as sort of like the third part of a menage a trois between Marston and Holloway just a couple of years after they got married. They got married in 1915. And she remained kind of in the picture now and then. And then in the 1920s, like I said, Olive Byrne came to live with the Marstons. Both Elizabeth, or Betty Marston, and Olive bore 2 children fathered by William Marston. In fact, here is a family photo from 1947, just 1 year before Marston died unexpectedly, I think, of a heart attack. And here you can see Marston in the center, and there on the bottom right is his wife Betty, and they're standing just over his shoulder to the right, which would be his left. You see Olive, and then sitting over to the far left, there's Marjorie, family friend, longtime close family friend, and then there's all the kids. In fact, after Marston passed away, Betty and Olive continued living together for decades, for the rest of their lives. In 2017, the movie Professor Marston and the Wonder Women was released around the same time that the new Wonder Woman movie from Warner Brothers was released. It was it was basically a dramatization of the biography of the Marstons, written by Jill Lepore, called the Secret History of Wonder Woman, in which she made the assertion, and proved it, I think, that the early years of the Marston family and the prelude to the creation of Wonder Woman, through the creation of Wonder Woman, is really a history of feminism in the early 20th century in the United States. The movie also dramatized the well-known and well-established fact that Marston and his wife Holloway and Byrne were very, very into S&M and bondage and role-playing. So think about all this in context of Wonder Woman. So the Family Circle article appeared in October, and by February, Marston had written out a script for his superhero, and his wife had recommended the superhero be a woman. So he took that, wrote out a script, and had already sent some instructions to the artist assigned to the book, H.G. Peter. And here he is sending that script in to the editor, Sheldon Meyer, the script for Suprema, the Wonder Woman. He dropped that part, Suprema, and just stuck with Wonder Woman. And he made clear to Meyer that he was perfectly fine with any changes the editor might want to make to the costume or to the backstory, but that there were certain things he did not want changed. So I'm going to read part of this letter, and I'm willing to bet that Sheldon Meyer wasn't used to getting letters like this from his comic book writers. So Marston says in the third paragraph, in fiction or articles, if you hit a universal theme, symbols, or experience, not merely reader identification, but something more, a special truth, you get really tremendous results. Whereas if you merely follow a fad slavishly, you don't get far or travel long. In this theme I'm using, I fully believe that I'm hitting a great movement now underway, the growth in power of women. And I want you to let that theme alone, or drop the project. But I'm sure from our talk that you see it as I do. Bear with me while I mention the undermeaning here. Men, Greeks, were captured by predatory love-seeking females until they got sick of it and made the women captive by force. But they were afraid of them, this is the masculine inferiority complex, and kept them heavily chained lest the women put one over as they always had before. The goddess of love comes along and helps women break their chains by giving them the greater force of real altruism, whereupon men turned about face and actually helped the women get away from domestic slavery, as men are doing now. The new women, thus freed and strengthened by supporting themselves on Paradise Island, developed enormous physical and mental power. But they have to use it for other people's benefit, or they go back to chains and weakness. Now, all this is true. And besides making just as exciting plots as false or phony themes, will inevitably hit a deep responsive chord in time in readers' minds, even in the medium of comics magazines. So that's why I want to keep this theme straight and just as it is. And here's a photo of all the players in question. From left to right, there's William Moulton Marston. Sitting down and standing beside him is H.G. Peters, the artist. By the way, there were some complaints about Peters' artwork because some people said that he was too old-fashioned. He was a little bit older than most of their artists. And that his women all looked like 1920s women, not 1940s women. They looked like flappers. Marston loved that. One has to wonder if that's because, as has been speculated, his design for Wonder Woman was based on one of his partners, Olive, and that would have been how she looked when he met her in the 1920s. Anyway, there's Peter, there's Sheldon Meyer, and there is Max Gaines over on the right. Well, as issue after issue came out, people started to notice there were other themes that seemed to keep recurring with great frequency beyond the empowerment of women. Specifically, women being tied up, particularly bound with chains, and a lot of women wrestling. And a good bit of whipping and spanking. And some of the women on the Educational Advisory Board noted not only the whipping and the spanking, and particularly the binding, but also the scarcity of clothing. There's also that lasso, which you may know as the lasso of truth, because that's what it was on the Super Friends. That's what it's been in the comic books for a long time. But in those first few years, it was more than just a bondage lie detector machine. It actually, with it, Wonder Woman, once she tied someone up, could force them to do whatever she said. Now, all that fits in with Marston and his polyamorous family's S&M lifestyle. It also fits in with the theme from a speech he had given in 1937, where he said, "The only hope for peace is to teach people who are full of pep and unbound force to enjoy being bound. Only when the control of self by others is more pleasant than the unbound assertion of self in human relationships can we hope for a stable, peaceful human society." And there's another thing that kind of flew over the heads of Sheldon Meyer and Max Gaines. You know, lots of superheroes at the time had catchphrases, like Superman's was "Great Scott." Captain Marvel would frequently say, "Holy moly." And Wonder Woman's catchphrase was, suffering Sappho. The Sappho in question, of course, would have been the ancient female Greek poet Sappho of Lesbos, who was known in particular for her erotic love poetry to other women, which is where the term lesbian originated, as did the adjective sapphic, which is a synonym for lesbian. That's a pretty bold move on the part of Marston, and there would be people later on who would catch it. So anyway, Wonder Woman made her first appearance in a solo backup feature in issue 8 of All-Star Comics. By issue 12, she had joined the Justice Society of America, and by issue 14, she had been given the great honor of being the secretary. Now, remember, the Justice Society stories and All-Star Comics, those were written by Gardner Fox, who was really good writer for the time, but was much more mainstream than William Moulton Marston was. It's hard to believe that Marston would have chosen to have Wonder Woman join the group as a secretary. If he'd been writing the title, you have to think she probably would have been the leader. But when other writers handled the character Wonder Woman, and they were all male writers in the 1940s and into the 50s, they would present her much differently than Marston had. In fact, she would tend to be presented after Marston died in 1948. She would tend to be presented more like a character in a romance comic, the sort of thing that the middle-aged men running the company thought that little girls would want to read about. So Wonder Woman went from rescuing Steve Trevor all the time and picking him up and throwing him over her shoulder or just carrying him in her arms to being the rescuee, and all of a sudden she became obsessed constantly with getting married and how to catch her man. So that's kind of an ignominious fate for the feminist Amazon, powerful leader created by William Moulton Marston.